sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Dominance in spaceflight capability brought the war between the Soviet Union and the U.S. to the next level. Nuclear missiles were intimidating and showed how technologically advanced a country was. This was an area where countries wanted to show off. It was a big surprise to the Americans when the Russians launched the Sputnik and the Luna. Following this, the United States jumped straight into this competition with the creation of the space program NASA. Space was most threatening when Russia started sending missile threats towards the United States. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik. The Sputnik was the first artificial man-made satellite that went into orbit around the Earth. This satellite was about the size of a beach ball, but weighed in around 184 pounds. The Sputnik took about 98 minutes to orbit the Earth on its elliptical path. This sparked fear into the Americans. Many Americans now thought that the Soviet Union was able to spy on the country and even shoot missiles towards the country from space. However, some Americans did not believe the launch was true, and they thought that the Soviets were saying this to better themselves in the Cold War. Whether Americans believed it or not, the space race would officially begin with the launch of the Sputnik.
The day my town heard that the Russians were going to launch a satellite, we became very scared. We did not know what the Soviet Union was going to use it for. Later that week, we got the news that they were launching it on October 4th, 1957 at 10:29 p.m. That was only a few days away, and as the time got closer, my town became more worried. It was finally October 4th, the town canceled school, and we mostly sat around the radio all day, trying to understand what the Sputnik would be used for. I remember that we didn't hear any news about the launch of the Sputnik till the following morning. The day after the Sputnik was supposed to be launched, when my family woke, we instantly turned on the radio to see if the launch was successful. When we found out that it was successful, I remember that we all had mixed emotions. Most of us were surprised that something could ever reach outer space, but my parents, however, were actually very nervous. They told us that although it was great that something had reached space, we needed to be aware that the satellite could bring danger. I'll always remember that day. It was the day that mankind did something some people thought was impossible.
To combat all the achievements Russia had made, the United States created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, most commonly known as NASA, on October 1st, 1958. And the program only got bigger from there. NASA took control of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was specifically created for the military's jets. NASA also took control of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was operated by the California Institute of Technology. NASA's top priority was to launch a manned vehicle into Earth's orbit, which of course was a disappointment due to the Russians sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit in the Vostok 1. NASA's budget increased about 500% during the space race. They also employed 34,000 workers and worked along with 375,000 industrial and university contractors. The creation of NASA would lead the Americans into the right direction. After launching the Sputnik, the Soviets launched the Luna 2 on September 12, 1959. After 6 failed attempts to send a probe to the moon, Luna 2 was the first success. Before the Luna 2 crashed into the moon, it sent back data of interplanetary space and sodium gas to the scientists who were observing from Earth. This caused the Americans to become even more dedicated to getting a man into space. However, on April 12, 1961, the Russians launched Vostok 1, which carried Yuri Gagarin into space, making him the first man in space. He was also the first man to orbit the Earth, but the Americans were not far behind. Alan Shepard became the first American in space on May 15, 1961, aboard the Mercury spacecraft Freedom 7. Shepard's mission lasted 15.5 minutes. During this time, he traveled 116 miles, then headed back for Earth. 1 month after the Soviet Union had sent the first man into space, the president stood before Congress to deliver a special message. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced a dramatic and ambitious goal. This goal would change America in many different ways.
They choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
President Kennedy called for human exploration on the moon. Most NASA's efforts turned to achieve the new goal of a lunar landing. During this time, Project Gemini was created. This was an early NASA human spaceflight program. The Gemini program allowed NASA to learn how astronauts could go outside of the spacecraft, what happened to an astronaut's body after several days in space, and gave NASA the ability to learn how two spacecrafts could come together in space. All of these would be crucial to accomplish President Kennedy's goal of a lunar landing. In 1959, NASA picked the first group of astronauts. This group of men would fly on the Mercury spacecraft. NASA would call them the Mercury 7. John Glenn would be one of them. In 1962, Glenn became the first astronaut to orbit the Earth. He spent 5 hours in space, orbiting the Earth 3 times. He named this spacecraft the Friendship 7. His mission would help NASA learn more about space. John Glenn started as a fighter pilot in World War II, then became what he is best known for, being the first American to orbit the Earth. He was awarded 76 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 18 Air Medals, which made him a very good candidate for senator. By 1974, John Glenn was elected to be the Senator of Ohio until 1999. In 1998, he became the oldest person to fly in space as a crew member of the Discovery Shuttle, and the only person to fly in both the Mercury and Space Shuttle programs. He later received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012 and sadly passed 4 years later. Soviet Union Chief Engineer and spacecraft designer Sergei Korolev, who is today credited with being the founder of the Soviet Union space program, helped the Soviet Union accomplish their many goals. However, on January 14, 1966, he passed away. His death left the Soviet Union's space program scrambling. The space program did not know what direction to proceed in next. At this point in time, safety precautions aboard spacecrafts was very minimal, but that all changed after the tragedy that was Apollo 1. On February 21, 1967, 3 astronauts, Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, were aboard the Apollo 1. They were conducting the launch rehearsal test when the flash of fire swept through the command module. Despite the efforts made by the crew, all 3 astronauts died and several others were asphyxiated by smoke trying to save them. After this incident, the safety precautions on spacecrafts were greatly increased. NASA did not try to send more men into space for about 18 months due to this. During these months, NASA was fixing their safety precautions to make sure future crews would not be harmed.
When I found out that my husband, Robert Chaffee, was killed in a spacecraft fire, I was devastated. After I finished putting our kids in bed that night, I heard some knocking at the door. I went to the door thinking it was Roger, but when I opened it, I was surprised to find out that it was his bosses. I remember hearing them saying that they were terribly sorry. After they said that, I became heartbroken. They continued to say that he was in a test module and the fire rose out of nowhere, killing all 3 men on the flight. After they said this, I closed the door, not knowing what to do next. The following morning, when I had to tell my children, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to face. However, looking back on it, he always wanted to go to space, and NASA learned so much from this disaster. I believe that without this disaster, they wouldn't have been able to reach the moon when they did.
On November 9, 1967, Apollo 4 was launched. This was the first unmanned test flight of Saturn V. This was the first Apollo mission after the incident that occurred during the Apollo 1 mission. The Apollo 7 mission launched on October 11, 1968. Also, it was the first manned mission to test the command and service module. The crew orbited the Earth 163 times, resulting in about 10 days and 20 hours in space. The launch of Apollo 8 on December 21, 1968 marked another big step in space history when it became the first mission to leave the Earth's orbit, reach the moon, return into the Earth's orbit, and safely come back to the Earth. On this mission, the astronauts did not set foot on the moon, they just orbited it. This mission set the footprints for the Apollo 11. NASA stunned everyone with the Apollo 11 mission. This mission would achieve the goal set by President Kennedy. Apollo 11 launched from Cape Canaveral on July 16, 1969. This rocket carried Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin. The mission landed on the moon on July 20, 1969. With over 530 million people watching Armstrong's image, Armstrong took the first steps on the lunar surface on July 21st, just 6 hours after landing. Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent about 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon's surface, and they brought back 47.5 pounds of lunar material, which took about 2 1/4 hours to do. Since this mission was broadcasted live and everyone around the world listened to Armstrong's famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," this mission seemed to end the space race due to the fact that after the Americans landed on the moon, the Soviets launched 4 failed attempts to land on the moon from 1969 to 1972. However, they were not able to achieve the same success as earlier in the space race when Sergei Korolev was their leader. Soyuz 19 was launched on July 15, 1975, carrying 2 Soviet Union astronauts. A few hours later, 3 U.S. astronauts aboard Apollo were launched. On July 17, 2012, the 2 spacecrafts met over the Atlantic Ocean, and at 3:17 p.m., the hatches between the spacecrafts were opened and the astronauts greeted each other and started joint activities. This handshake in space seemed to symbolize the improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations and would officially put an end to the space race. The space race was important because it showed to the world which country had the best science, technology, and economic system. It also made both Russia and the United States realize the importance of rocket research to the military. The space race has left the United States with a goal of sending humans to Mars's surface in the 2030s. The space race will be remembered as a time when humans seemed to do the impossible.